The Texas sun hung like a merciless copper coin in the endless sky, its rays beating down on the weathered planks of Broken Creek Ranch with the persistence of a debt collector. The year was 1885, and the vast expanse of West Texas stretched beyond the horizon like God's own canvas, painted in shades of dust, sage, and endless possibility. But for Samuel "Sam" Mackenzie, the landscape held no promise, only the weight of memories too heavy to carry and too painful to set down. At 52, Sam possessed the kind of weathered handsomeness that comes from decades under the unforgiving sun, his face carved by wind and worry into something resembling the canyon walls that dotted his property. His hands, once steady enough to thread a needle or gentle a wild stallion, now trembled slightly as they reached for the bottle of whiskey that had become his most faithful companion. The amber liquid caught the afternoon light, refracting it into patterns that reminded him of Margaret's hair when she'd stand in the kitchen window, flour dusting her apron, humming melodies that made the whole house feel alive. The ranch house sprawled before him like a testament to dreams deferred. Built in 1870 when Sam was still young and foolish enough to believe that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle, the structure had been designed to accommodate the large family he and Margaret had planned. Wide porches wrapped around the building like protective arms, their railings carved with intricate designs that Margaret had sketched during their first winter together. The house boasted 12 rooms, each one carefully planned for children who would never come, for Christmas mornings that would never echo with laughter, for a future that died in a pool of blood on a rain-soaked October night 10 years ago. Now, most of those rooms stood empty, their doors closed against memories too sharp to face. Sam lived primarily in the kitchen and the front room, moving through his domain like a ghost haunting his own castle. The dust motes that danced in the afternoon light seemed to mock him, settling on furniture that no one used, on picture frames turned face down because the smiles they contained hurt too much to witness. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd become the wealthiest man in 3 counties and the loneliest. Broken Creek Ranch stretched across nearly 50,000 acres, its boundaries marked by weathered fence posts that stood like sentinels guarding an empire built on sorrow. His cattle, nearly 3,000 head of prime Texas Longhorns, grazed across pastures that could have supported twice their number. The ranch employed 47 men, from seasoned cowhands to young drifters looking for honest work, all of whom treated their boss with the kind of careful respect reserved for wild animals that might bite. Jake Morrison, his foreman for the past 15 years, was the only man brave enough to approach Sam directly. Tall and lean, with graying hair and eyes the color of storm clouds, Jake had known Sam since before the tragedy, had seen him transform from a man who could command a room with his laughter to one who could empty it with his silence. Every morning, Jake would approach the porch with the day's report, his hat in his hands, speaking in careful measured tones about cattle counts and fence repairs, while Sam stared into his whiskey glass as if it held the answers to questions he'd stopped asking. "Boss, we got about 200 head down in the south pasture showing signs of that respiratory thing we saw last month," Jake would report, his voice steady despite the way Sam's bloodshot eyes never quite focused on his face. "Doc Peterson says we should separate them before it spreads." Sam's responses had become increasingly monosyllabic over the years, a series of grunts and nods that Jake had learned to interpret like a foreign language. "Do it," Sam would mumble, or sometimes just a wave of his hand that meant Jake should handle whatever crisis had arisen. The foreman had effectively been running the ranch for years, making decisions that would have once required hours of discussion and planning. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. For the first year after Margaret's death, Sam had thrown himself into work with the desperate energy of a man trying to outrun his demons. He'd expanded the ranch, bought more cattle, worked from dawn to dusk until exhaustion granted him a few hours of dreamless sleep. But grief has a way of wearing down even the strongest men, and by the second year the cracks had begun to show. By the third year the bottle had become his morning companion. By the 5th year it was his only companion. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge, the small community that had grown up around the success of Broken Creek Ranch, had long since learned to avoid their former hero. They remembered the man who had arrived in 1868 with nothing but a strong back and bigger dreams, who had built an empire from dust and determination, who had been the first to lend a hand when neighbors needed help and the first to open his wallet when the church needed a new roof. That man had been larger than life, the kind of figure around whom legends grew. Now they saw only a broken shell, a man who appeared in town perhaps once a month to collect supplies, his clothes rumpled, his face unshaven, his eyes holding the kind of hollow look that made people cross the street to avoid him. The shopkeepers would nod respectfully and accept his money, but conversation had dwindled to mere pleasantries years ago. Children who had once run to greet him now hid behind their mothers' skirts, frightened by the ghost of the man they'd once known. The local saloon, O'Malley's, had become accustomed to Sam's occasional visits, silent affairs where he would sit alone in the corner, nursing whiskey and glaring at anyone brave enough to approach. The other patrons had learned to give him wide berth, understanding instinctively that this was a man balanced on the edge of something dangerous. Bar fights had become more common during his visits, not because Sam initiated them, but because his presence somehow made the air itself feel volatile. Dr. Henry Caldwell, the town's physician and one of the few men who still dared to speak honestly to Sam, had made several attempts over the years to reach his old friend, a small, precise man with kind eyes and the patience of a saint. Dr. Caldwell had been the one to deliver the news that night 10 years ago, had been the one to hold Sam back when he'd tried to claw his way into the grave after Margaret's coffin. Now, whenever their paths crossed, the doctor would study Sam with professional concern, noting the yellowing of his skin, the tremor in his hands, the way his once powerful frame had begun to waste away. "Sam," Dr. Caldwell had said during their last encounter, his voice carefully neutral, "you're killing yourself by degrees. Margaret wouldn't want this." The response had been typical Sam, a grunt and a turned shoulder, a dismissal that ended the conversation before it could begin. But the doctor's words had hit their mark, adding another layer of guilt to the already crushing weight Sam carried. He knew Margaret wouldn't want this, knew she would be horrified by what he'd become, but knowing and caring had become two very different things. The ranch hands treated their boss with the mixture of respect and wariness one might show a wounded bear. They understood that Sam Mackenzie was still dangerous, that beneath the alcohol and self-pity lay a man who had once been formidable, who could still outdraw most men half his age when pressed. They'd seen flashes of the old Sam during the rare moments when his protective instincts flared, when a rattlesnake threatened the horses, when strangers with questionable intentions appeared at the ranch, when his cattle were threatened by rustlers or predators. Tommy Chen, a young Chinese-American cowhand who had joined the crew 2 years earlier, had been the only one brave enough to ask Jake about the boss's story. The two men had been mending fence in the north pasture when Tommy, his English still heavily accented but clear, had nodded toward the distant figure of Sam sitting on his porch. "Why he always alone?" Tommy had asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. Jake had paused in his work, his weathered hands gripping the wire cutters, as he considered how to explain a decade of pain. "He wasn't always that way, son. Time was this whole ranch rang with laughter. Miss Margaret, she had a way of making everyone feel welcome like they were part of something bigger than themselves. She'd have the whole crew over for Sunday dinner, and the boss, well, he used to smile so wide you could see it from the next county." Tommy had listened with the attention of someone trying to understand a world very different from his own. "What happened to her?" "Child-bringing," Jake had said simply, the euphemism common in a time when discussing such things directly was considered improper. "She and the baby both. Doctor did everything he could, but sometimes that's just how it goes." The young man had nodded solemnly, understanding passing between them without need for further explanation. In the silence that followed, both men had returned to their work, but the conversation had illustrated something important about the dynamic at Broken Creek Ranch. The men who worked there weren't just employees. They were part of a community that had been frozen in time, suspended between what was and what might have been. The house itself had become a monument to that suspension. In the master bedroom, Margaret's clothes still hung in the wardrobe, her hairbrush still sat on the vanity, her Bible still lay open to the passage she'd been reading the night before she died. Sam hadn't touched any of it, couldn't bear to pack away the physical remnants of their life together. The nursery, painted a cheerful yellow because they'd wanted to be surprised by the baby's gender, remained exactly as they'd left it, the rocking chair positioned by the window where Margaret had planned to nurse their child, the handmade quilts folded neatly in the chest at the foot of the crib. Sometimes, late at night when the whiskey had numbed his usual caution, Sam would stand in the doorway of that room and imagine he could hear Margaret's voice, could smell her lavender soap, could feel her presence in the house they'd built together. These moments were both a blessing and a curse. They provided temporary relief from the endless ache of loss, but they also made the return to reality that much more brutal. The ranch's success had continued despite Sam's withdrawal, a testament to the solid foundation he'd built before tragedy struck. The cattle thrived on the rich grasslands, the markets in Kansas City and Chicago remained hungry for Texas beef, and the railroad connections he'd established years earlier continued to move his product efficiently to buyers across the country. Money flowed into the ranch's accounts with mechanical regularity, but it meant nothing to a man who had lost the reason he'd wanted to build an empire in the first place. Letters arrived regularly from business associates in distant cities, invitations to cattle conventions and meetings of the Texas Cattlemen's Association, offers to sell his land for astronomical sums from investors who saw opportunity in the growing railroad network. All of them went unanswered. filed away by Jake, who had taken over most of the administrative duties by default. The outside world had learned to work around Sam Mackenzie's grief, but it hadn't forgotten him entirely. As the afternoon shadows lengthened across the ranch yard, Sam remained on his porch, the bottle beside him marking time more reliably than the grandfather clock in the hallway. The cattle moved slowly across the distant pastures, their lowing carried on the wind like a lullaby he'd long since stopped hearing. The hands would be finishing their work soon, heading to the bunkhouse for supper and cards, and the kind of easy camaraderie that Sam remembered but could no longer participate in. The weather had been unusually humid for Texas in late summer, the air thick with the promise of rain that might or might not come. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon like dark thoughts, but Sam paid them no attention. Weather, like everything else in his narrowed world, had become background noise to the more immediate concerns of maintaining his carefully constructed numbness. He didn't know that tonight would be different, couldn't have imagined that the storm brewing in the distance would bring more than just rain to Broken Creek Ranch, had no way of knowing that his decade-long isolation was about to be shattered by a desperate soul who would prove that sometimes salvation comes in the most unexpected forms. The whiskey bottle caught the last rays of sunlight, casting amber shadows across the porch floor where Margaret used to sit with her sewing, humming melodies that made the whole world seem brighter. Tonight, those shadows would dance to a different rhythm, one that would pull Sam Mackenzie back into a world he'd thought he'd left behind forever. Chapter 2. The Storm That Changed Everything. The first drops of rain began to fall just as the sun disappeared behind the western mountains, each droplet striking the parched earth with the intensity of a promise finally kept. The air, which had been thick and oppressive all day, suddenly came alive with the electric charge that precedes a true Texas storm. Sam Mackenzie felt it in his bones, the way old injuries always predicted weather changes, but he remained on his porch, the whiskey bottle steady in his hands, watching the sky darken with the dispassionate interest of a man who had long since stopped caring about the world beyond his immediate reach. The storm built slowly at first, as Texas storms often do, gathering strength and fury in the endless expanse of sky before unleashing their power upon the earth below. Lightning flickered in the distance, silent flashes that illuminated the rolling clouds like candles behind stained glass. Thunder followed, a low rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, growing stronger with each passing minute until it became a constant presence, a drum beat announcing the approaching tempest. Sam's ranch hands had taken shelter in the bunkhouse, their evening meal abandoned in favor of securing windows and doors against the coming deluge. Jake Morrison had stopped by the main house earlier, his weathered face creased with concern as he'd suggested that Sam move inside, away from the metal roof of the porch that would soon become a target for the electrical fury above. "Boss, this one's going to be a real gully washer," Jake had said, his voice raised slightly to be heard over the increasing wind. "You might want to think about moving inside, at least until it passes." Sam's response had been predictable, a grunt and a wave of his hand that indicated he had no intention of altering his routine for something as trivial as weather. Jake had lingered for a moment, his loyalty warring with his practical nature, before nodding and heading back to the safety of the bunkhouse. He'd learned years ago that Sam Mackenzie was a man who would make his own choices, regardless of their wisdom or consequences. Now, as the storm reached its full fury, Sam began to understand what his foreman had meant. The rain came down in sheets driven by winds that transformed each drop into a tiny missile, creating a wall of water that made it impossible to see beyond the immediate vicinity of the porch. The thunder was no longer a distant rumble but a continuous roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, while lightning split the sky with such frequency that the world alternated between brilliant illumination and absolute darkness in rapid succession. Despite the chaos around him, Sam remained in his chair, the whiskey providing a buffer between himself and the storm's fury. He'd weathered worse, he told himself, though the truth was that he'd weathered worse when he'd cared about survival, when he'd had reasons to seek shelter and safety. Now, there was a part of him that found the storm's violence oddly comforting, an external manifestation of the turmoil that had been raging inside him for a decade. The ranch house, built to withstand the extremes of Texas weather, groaned and creaked under the assault but held firm. Sam had constructed it with Margaret's safety in mind, using the finest materials and the most skilled craftsmen available, creating a fortress that could protect the family they'd planned to raise together. The irony that he now sat exposed to the elements while the empty rooms behind him remained perfectly safe was not lost on him, though he felt only a dull acknowledgement of the contradiction, rather than any urge to change his situation. It was during a particularly violent lightning strike that Sam first heard it, a sound so faint and unexpected that he initially dismissed it as his imagination. But as the thunder faded and the rain continued its relentless assault, the sound came again, a weak, rhythmic tapping that seemed to be coming from the front door of the house. Sam's alcohol-fogged mind struggled to process this anomaly. No one came to Broken Creek Ranch uninvited, especially not during a storm like this. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and the town of Cedar Ridge was even farther. The idea that someone would be traveling on a night like this, much less seeking shelter at his door, seemed impossible. But the tapping continued, growing slightly more insistent, and with it came something else. A voice barely audible above the storm's roar, calling out in tones that spoke of desperation and fear. "Please, somebody, help me." The words were fragmented, carried away by the wind almost as soon as they were spoken, but they penetrated Sam's consciousness like nothing had in years. He set down his whiskey glass with uncharacteristic care and stood, his movements slow and deliberate as he tried to determine whether what he was hearing was real or simply another manifestation of his guilt-ridden subconscious. "Help, please." There it was again, weak but unmistakably human, unmistakably desperate. Sam found himself moving toward the door, his bare feet silent on the wooden floor of the porch. The rain immediately soaked through his shirt, cold and shocking against skin that had grown accustomed to the warmth of whiskey and self-pity. The knocking was real, he realized as he approached the door. Weak, erratic, but definitely the sound of someone seeking entry. Sam's hand hesitated on the door handle, years of isolation warring with instincts that had been buried but not destroyed. Opening this door would mean allowing another human being into his carefully constructed world of solitude and pain. It would mean interaction, conversation, the possibility of connection that he'd spent a decade avoiding. But the knocking continued, and with it came a sound that cut through all his defenses. The sound of a woman crying, her sobs barely audible but unmistakably desperate. "Please, they're coming. I can't. Please." Sam's hand moved of its own accord, turning the handle and pulling the door open to reveal a sight that would be burned into his memory forever. A young woman stood, or rather swayed in his doorway, her naked body covered in mud and rain, her dark hair plastered to her head, her eyes wide with terror and exhaustion. She was perhaps 25, small and delicate, but there was something in her posture that spoke of strength beneath the obvious vulnerability. Emma, though Sam didn't know her name yet, looked up at him with eyes that held the same desperate hope he'd seen in the eyes of wounded animals, the look of a creature that had run as far as it could and had nowhere left to go. Her skin was pale beneath the mud, marked with bruises that were visible even in the flickering lightning, and her feet were torn and bleeding from running barefoot across the rocky terrain. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Please, they're coming for me." And then she collapsed, her slight form crumpling against the door frame as consciousness finally abandoned her. Sam reacted without thinking, his body moving before his mind could process what was happening. He caught her as she fell, his arms automatically wrapping around her small frame, and for the first time in 10 years, he held another human being. The contact was electric, shocking him out of his alcoholic haze more effectively than any amount of coffee or cold water could have done. She was real, solid, warm despite the rain and cold, and completely helpless. All of Sam's protective instincts, dormant for so long he'd forgotten they existed, flared to life in that moment. He carried her inside, kicking the door closed behind him with his foot, shutting out the storm and the outside world. The house, which had felt like a tomb for so long, suddenly seemed to pulse with life again. Sam laid Emma on the couch in the front room, then rushed to gather blankets and towels, his movements quick and purposeful in a way they hadn't been for years. As he worked to warm her and clean the mud from her skin, Sam found himself truly seeing another person for the first time in a decade. Emma was beautiful, but it was a beauty marked by suffering, the kind of refined features that spoke of good breeding, now marred by exhaustion and fear. Her hands were soft, suggesting a life that hadn't always included hard physical labor, but her nails were broken and bloody from clawing her way through the night. While she remained unconscious, Sam built up the fire in the fireplace, heating water on the stove and gathering supplies that might be needed to treat her injuries. The domestic tasks felt foreign after so many years of solitary existence, but they also felt right in a way that surprised him. Taking care of another person, having a purpose beyond his own pain, awakened something in him that he'd thought was dead forever. Emma stirred as the warmth began to penetrate her chilled body, her eyes fluttering open to find Sam sitting nearby, a cup of hot coffee in his hands. She startled, her body tensing as if preparing to flee, but Sam's voice, rusty from disuse but somehow gentle, stopped her. "Easy there," he said, his tone the same one he'd once used to calm frightened horses. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you." She studied his face in the firelight, taking in the weathered features, the bloodshot eyes, the unshaven jaw, but also something else, a kindness that hadn't been completely extinguished by grief and alcohol. Slowly she nodded, accepting the coffee with hands that shook from more than just cold. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I didn't think anyone would help me." Sam found himself really listening to another person for the first time in years, hearing not just the words but the pain and fear behind them. "Who was chasing you?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Emma's eyes darted to the windows, as if expecting to see faces peering through the glass. "Bad men," she said simply. "Men who bought me, who think they own me." The words hit Sam like a physical blow. He'd heard whispers of such things, knew that the frontier could be a dangerous place for women without protection, but hearing it directly from someone who had experienced it was different. The protectiveness that had once made him legendary in 3 counties surged back to life, stronger than it had ever been. "Well, they don't own you," Sam said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had once commanded respect across half of Texas. "Not anymore." Emma looked at him with surprise, perhaps hearing something in his voice that she hadn't expected. "You don't understand," she said. "They won't give up. They'll come for me." "Let them come," Sam replied, and for the first time in 10 years he meant it. "This is my land and you're under my protection now." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the ranch house, something fundamental had shifted. The silence that had once felt like peace now felt like a prison that Sam was finally ready to escape. Emma's presence had broken through the walls he'd built around himself, and for the first time since Margaret's death, he felt the stirring of purpose, the beginning of a reason to fight. As Emma fell asleep on the couch, wrapped in Margaret's old quilts, Sam sat in his chair and watched over her. The whiskey bottle remained unopened on the table beside him, forgotten in favor of this new responsibility. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, didn't know what dangers might be coming for the woman who had appeared at his door, like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was praying. But for the first time in a decade, Sam Mackenzie was looking forward to finding out. Chapter 3. Healing What's Broken. Dawn broke over Broken Creek Ranch like a benediction, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed to wash away the violence of the previous night's storm. The air, cleansed by the rain, carried the scent of sage and wet earth, and the world appeared reborn in the soft morning light. Sam Mackenzie stood at the kitchen window, a cup of coffee in his hands, watching the sun rise over land that suddenly seemed to hold promise again. He'd spent the night in his chair, dozing fitfully while keeping watch over Emma, who had slept deeply under the pile of quilts he'd provided. Every few hours he'd checked on her, ensuring she was still breathing, still safe, still there. The responsibility felt foreign after so many years of caring for nothing but his own pain, but it also felt right in a way that surprised him. Emma woke slowly, her body protesting the previous night's ordeal. As consciousness gradually returned, Sam heard her stirring and moved to the living room, where he found her sitting up on the couch, the quilts wrapped around her like a protective cocoon. In the gentle morning light, he could see the full extent of her injuries, bruises that painted her arms and legs in shades of purple and yellow, cuts on her feet that spoke of a desperate flight through rough terrain, and something else in her eyes that spoke of deeper wounds that would take much longer to heal. "How are you feeling?" Sam asked, his voice still rusty from disuse but somehow gentler than it had been in years. Emma looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and wariness, as if she couldn't quite believe in his kindness. "Better," she said softly. "Thank you for everything." Sam nodded, unsure how to respond to gratitude he felt he didn't deserve. "You hungry? I could make some breakfast." The offer surprised them both. Sam hadn't cooked for another person in 10 years, had barely bothered to feed himself beyond the most basic necessities, but Emma's presence had awakened something in him, a desire to care for someone else that felt both foreign and completely natural. "I don't want to be any trouble," Emma said, her voice small. "You're not," Sam replied, and meant it. "Trouble would be if you weren't here." The admission hung between them, unexpected and profound. Sam hadn't meant to reveal so much, but Emma's presence had a way of drawing truth from him, of making him say things he'd kept buried for years. Over breakfast, eggs fresh from the ranch's henhouse, bread that Sam had to dust off before slicing, coffee that was stronger than it had been in years, Emma began to share her story. She spoke hesitantly at first, testing the waters of trust, but something in Sam's patient attention encouraged her to continue. Her name was Emma Catherine Hartwell, and she had been born in Boston to a family of modest means. Her father had been a clerk in a shipping office, her mother a seamstress who took in extra work to make ends meet. Emma had been educated, could read and write well, and had dreams of becoming a teacher, but her father had made some poor investment choices, borrowed money from the wrong people, and when he died suddenly of a heart attack, those debts had fallen to Emma. "They told me I could work them off," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Clean their saloon, serve drinks, nothing more, but that wasn't what they wanted. They wanted other things." Sam felt his jaw tighten as he listened, his protective instincts flaring stronger than they had in years. He'd known men like the ones Emma described, had encountered them in his younger days when he'd been quick to use his fists to defend the innocent. The thought of what they'd put her through made his hands clench around his coffee cup. I tried to leave, Emma continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. But they said I belonged to them until the debt was paid. They kept me locked up, made me do things I never want to think about again. But last night, during the storm, one of them got careless, left a door unlocked. I ran. How far did you run? Sam asked, his voice rough with emotion. I don't know. Miles. I just kept running until I couldn't anymore, until I saw your light. The simple statement hit Sam harder than any elaborate declaration could have. She'd seen his light, the lamp he'd kept burning out of habit more than hope, and it had led her to safety. For the first time in 10 years, his presence had meant something to someone else, had been a beacon rather than a burden. They'll come looking for you, Sam said, not as a warning but as a statement of fact. Emma nodded, her eyes darting to the windows. I know. I can't stay here. I won't bring trouble to your door. The hell you won't, Sam replied, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had once commanded respect across half of Texas. This is my land, and you're under my protection now. Let them come. Over the following days, as Emma recovered from her ordeal, Broken Creek Ranch began to transform in ways that surprised everyone who witnessed it. Emma insisted on helping with whatever tasks she could manage, despite Sam's protests that she should rest. She started with small things, washing dishes, tidying the rooms that had been neglected for years, preparing meals that went beyond Sam's usual fare of beans and hardtack. The kitchen, which had stood empty except for Sam's minimal cooking, came alive with the sounds and smells of proper food preparation. Emma found Margaret's old recipe box, dusty but intact, and began working her way through the carefully written instructions. The aroma of fresh bread filled the house for the first time in a decade, and Sam found himself drawn to the kitchen not just for meals but for the simple pleasure of watching someone else bring life to his home. Your wife was a good cook, Emma said one afternoon, flour dusting her apron as she kneaded dough for the evening's bread. She'd found one of Margaret's old dresses in the wardrobe, and with some basic alterations, it fit her reasonably well. Sam was sitting at the kitchen table, ostensibly reading a week-old newspaper but actually just watching Emma work. She was, he said simply. She was good at everything. Emma looked up from her work, studying his face with the careful attention of someone who understood pain. Tell me about her. And to his surprise, Sam did. He told Emma about meeting Margaret at a church social in Cedar Ridge, about how she'd been the prettiest girl there but had chosen to spend her evening talking to the awkward young rancher who was clearly out of his depth. He told her about their courtship, conducted mostly on the front porch of her father's house under the watchful eye of her mother, about how Margaret had seen something in him that he hadn't even known existed. She believed in me, Sam said, his voice soft with memory. Believed I could build something lasting out here. When we married, she came to this ranch when it was nothing but a shack and a handful of cattle, and she never once complained, never once suggested we should move somewhere easier. Emma listened with the kind of attention that healing people give to each other, understanding that Sam's willingness to share these memories was a gift. She sounds wonderful. She was, Sam agreed. She was everything I ever wanted, and I lost her. You didn't lose her, Emma said gently. She's still here in everything you built together, in this house, in this ranch, in the man you are. Sam looked at her with surprise. The man I am isn't much to speak of. The man you are saved my life, Emma replied. The man you are gave me shelter when I had nowhere else to go. The man you are is still in there, just buried under grief. Their conversations became a daily ritual, occurring over meals or while working together on various tasks around the ranch. Sam found himself telling Emma things he'd never told anyone, sharing memories and fears and hopes that had been locked away for years. In return, Emma shared her own stories, her childhood in Boston, her dreams of teaching, her love of books and learning. I used to imagine having a classroom full of children, Emma said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, teaching them to read, to write, to think for themselves. It seems foolish now. It's not foolish, Sam replied. It's beautiful. Dreams like that, they're what make life worth living. Emma looked at him with something like hope in her eyes. Do you think it's possible? To start over, to build something new from something broken? Sam considered the question, looking out over the ranch that had been his life's work, thinking about the woman beside him whose presence had already begun to heal wounds he'd thought were permanent. I think, he said slowly, that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most broken ground. Jake Morrison, Sam's foreman, had been watching the transformation of his boss with a mixture of amazement and concern. The man who had been slowly drinking himself to death for 10 years had suddenly become someone Jake remembered from the old days. Alert, engaged, protective. The change had been so dramatic that Jake had initially suspected it wouldn't last. that Sam would eventually retreat back into his shell of grief and alcohol. But as the days passed, Jake realized that something fundamental had shifted. Sam was asking questions about the ranch again, showing interest in the cattle and the land that had been his passion before tragedy struck. He was eating regularly, sleeping better, and most importantly, he was sober. The whiskey bottle that had been his constant companion for a decade now sat untouched on the side table, gathering dust. "Boss seems different," Charlie Martinez, one of the younger ranch hands, observed to Jake one morning as they watched Sam and Emma working together to repair a section of fence. "Different how?" Jake asked, though he knew exactly what Charlie meant. "Alive," Charlie said simply, "like he's got something to fight for again." Jake nodded, understanding the truth of that observation. Sam Mackenzie had been existing rather than living for 10 years, going through the motions of daily life without any real purpose or passion. Emma's presence had changed that, had given him something to protect and care for, had reminded him of who he used to be. But Jake also knew that the relative peace of the past few days couldn't last. Word traveled fast in the frontier, and if Emma had indeed escaped from the kind of men she'd described, they would eventually track her to Broken Creek Ranch. When that happened, Sam would have to make a choice about how far he was willing to go to protect her. The answer to that question came sooner than anyone expected. On a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after Emma's arrival, dust clouds appeared on the horizon, moving steadily toward the ranch. Jake counted 4 riders, moving with the purposeful urgency of men on a mission. "Boss," Jake called out, his voice carrying the kind of urgency that brought Sam running from the house. "We got company coming. 4 riders coming fast." Sam's face hardened as he stepped onto the porch, his hand automatically moving to check the pistol at his hip. Beside him, Emma had gone pale, her hands trembling as she recognized the implications of the approaching riders. "They found me," she whispered, her voice filled with fear and resignation. Sam looked at her, seeing the terror in her eyes, and felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. "Get in the house," he said quietly. "Stay away from the windows." Emma looked at him with desperate gratitude. "Sam, they're dangerous. They won't hesitate to hurt you." "Let them try," Sam replied, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had found something worth fighting for. "This is my land, and you're under my protection." As the riders approached, Sam could see that they were exactly what he'd expected. Hard men with cold eyes and the kind of casual cruelty that came from years of taking what they wanted by force. But Sam Mackenzie had been a hard man once too, before grief had softened him, and he could feel that part of himself awakening as he prepared to defend what was his. The confrontation that was coming would test everything Sam had rebuilt in the past week, would force him to choose between the safety of isolation and the risk of engagement. But as he stood on his porch watching the riders approach, Sam felt more alive than he had in 10 years. The ghost of Broken Creek Ranch was about to remember what it meant to be dangerous. Chapter 4: When the Past Comes Calling. The 4 riders approached Broken Creek Ranch with the calculated swagger of men accustomed to taking what they wanted through intimidation and violence. Their horses kicked up clouds of dust that hung in the still morning air like a harbinger of the trouble they brought with them. Sam Mackenzie stood on his porch, his body loose and ready, his hand resting casually on the butt of his Colt .45, a weapon that had seen considerable use in his younger days but had been gathering dust for a decade. Behind him, Emma had retreated into the house as instructed, but Sam could feel her presence just beyond the doorway, could sense her fear and determination in equal measure. The knowledge that she was depending on him, that her safety rested in his hands, awakened something in Sam that had been dormant for too long. The protective instincts that had once made him legendary in 3 counties surged back to life, stronger and more focused than they had ever been. Jake Morrison emerged from the barn, his own hand resting on his pistol, flanked by several of the ranch hands who had been alerted by the approaching riders. Charlie Martinez, Tommy Chen, and 3 other men spread out across the ranch yard, their faces grim with the understanding that this confrontation could turn deadly in a heartbeat. These were good men, loyal to Sam and to each other, and they would stand with their boss regardless of the odds. The leader of the approaching group was immediately recognizable as Clayton Burke, even though Sam had never met the man personally. Burke cut an imposing figure, tall and lean, with the kind of expensive clothes that marked him as a man of means, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a predator. He was perhaps 40 years old, with premature gray at his temples and the kind of practiced smile that never reached his eyes. His reputation in Cedar Ridge was well known. He owned the Golden Nugget Saloon, but everyone understood that his real business involved things that decent people didn't discuss in polite company. Flanking Burke were 3 men who looked like exactly what they were: hired guns with the kind of casual cruelty that came from years of inflicting pain for money. Vance Crockett, Burke's right-hand man, was a stocky brute with scarred knuckles, and the dead eyes of a man who had killed before and would kill again without hesitation. Luis Valdez was younger, perhaps 25, but his reputation with a knife was well established throughout the territory. The third man, Dutch Brennan, was a gunfighter whose speed with a pistol was matched only by his complete lack of conscience. The riders reined in their horses about 20 yards from the porch, close enough for conversation but far enough to avoid any sudden moves. Burke's smile was perfectly calculated, friendly on the surface but with an underlying threat that was unmistakable. "Mr. Mackenzie," Burke called out, his voice carrying the cultured tones of an educated man. "I'm Clayton Burke, and I believe you have something that belongs to me." Sam's response was measured, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had once commanded respect across half of Texas. "I don't believe we've been introduced, Mr. Burke, and I'm not in the habit of keeping things that don't belong to me." Burke's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, but you are, sir. You see, there's a young woman on your property, a woman who owes me a considerable debt. I've come to collect what's mine. The only thing you're going to collect today is regret if you don't turn those horses around and head back to whatever hole you crawled out of," Sam replied, his tone conversational but with an edge that made several of Burke's men shift uncomfortably in their saddles. The standoff stretched for a long moment, both men taking each other's measure. Burke was clearly surprised by Sam's resistance. He'd expected to find a broken-down drunk, not the man who stood before him now. Sam, for his part, was assessing the tactical situation, noting the positions of Burke's men, the angles of potential cover, the distance to the house where Emma waited. "Mr. Mackenzie," Burke said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "I think perhaps you don't understand the situation. That girl has been working for me for over a year, paying off debts her father incurred. She's stolen from me, damaged my property, and cost me a considerable amount of money. She belongs to me until those debts are satisfied." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Sam replied, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had found something worth fighting for. "Not to you, not to anyone. She's under my protection now." Burke's facade of civility began to crack. "Your protection? Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I own half of Cedar Ridge and I have connections throughout the territory. You're just one man, Mackenzie, and you're standing between me and what's mine." "I'm one man on my own land," Sam corrected, "surrounded by men who've been with me for years. You're four men who've made the mistake of coming here uninvited. I'd say the odds are about even." It was then that Emma stepped out of the house, her chin raised defiantly despite the obvious fear in her eyes. She wore one of Margaret's old dresses, and her hair was pinned back in a way that gave her a dignity that contrasted sharply with the circumstances of her arrival. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and clear. "Hello, Clayton," she said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone present. "I was wondering when you'd come slithering out from under your rock." Burke's face darkened at her words, his carefully maintained composure slipping. "Emma, darling, you've caused me a great deal of trouble, but I'm willing to forgive and forget if you come back with me now. We can discuss your punishment in private." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Emma replied, moving to stand beside Sam on the porch. "I've paid whatever debt you think I owe, and I'm done being your prisoner." "You're done when I say you're done," Burke snarled, his true nature finally showing through. "You cost me money, girl, and I always collect my debts, one way or another." Sam stepped forward, his body language shifting into something more dangerous. "The lady has made her position clear. I suggest you respect it." Burke looked between Sam and Emma, his mind clearly working through the implications of the situation. "You know what she is, don't you, Mackenzie? You know what she's been doing to pay off her debts? And you still want to protect her?" "I know what you forced her to do," Sam replied, his voice deadly quiet. "And I know what kind of man that makes you. It also makes this conversation over." The tension in the air was palpable, every man present understanding that they were balanced on the edge of violence. Burke's men had their hands positioned near their weapons, while Sam's ranch hands had spread out to create crossfire angles. Any sudden move could turn the ranch yard into a battlefield. "You're making a mistake, Mackenzie," Burke said, his voice low with menace. "I have resources, connections, legal backing. I can make your life very difficult." "You can try," Sam replied, "but you'll find it harder than you think. I've been making difficult decisions for longer than you've been alive, and I've survived worse than anything you can throw at me." Burke studied Sam's face, seeing something there that made him reconsider his approach. The man standing before him wasn't the broken-down drunk he'd expected to find, but someone far more dangerous, a man who had found something worth fighting for and was prepared to go to any lengths to protect it. "This isn't over," Burke said finally, pulling his horse's reins tight. "Emma belongs to me legally, and I'll use every resource at my disposal to get her back. You've made an enemy today, Mackenzie, and I'm not the forgiving type." "Neither am I," Sam replied. "And unlike you, I don't have to hide behind hired guns and legal technicalities. If you want to take her, you'll have to go through me." Burke's smile was cold and calculated. That can be arranged. The confrontation ended with Burke and his men wheeling their horses around and riding back toward Cedar Ridge, but everyone present understood that it was merely the first round in a conflict that was far from over. Sam watched them go, his body remaining alert until they disappeared over the horizon. "They'll be back," Emma said quietly, her voice trembling slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. "Let them come," Sam replied, his arm finding its way around her shoulders in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "This is my land, and you're my responsibility now. No one takes what's mine." Jake Morrison approached the porch, his weathered face creased with concern. "Boss, Burke's got connections throughout the territory. Legal connections. He might be able to cause real trouble." Sam nodded, understanding the implications. "Then we'll deal with it when it comes. In the meantime, double the watch. I want men posted around the clock, and I want everyone armed and ready." Over the following days, Broken Creek Ranch transformed into something resembling a fortress. Sam's men took shifts, standing guard. Weapons were cleaned and loaded, and everyone remained alert for signs of Burke's return. But despite the tension, life on the ranch continued, and if anything, the shared danger brought the community closer together. Emma threw herself into the work of the ranch with renewed determination, as if proving her worth through labor. She cooked for the men, tended to injuries, and began teaching some of the younger hands to read and write during the evening hours. Her presence had become a source of strength for everyone, a reminder of what they were fighting to protect. Sam found himself changing in ways that surprised him. The lethargy and despair that had characterized his life for 10 years was being replaced by a sense of purpose and vitality that he'd thought was lost forever. He was eating regularly, sleeping better, and most importantly, he was sober. The whiskey bottle that had been his constant companion sat untouched, no longer necessary now that he had something real to focus on. "You're different," Emma observed one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "From the man I met that first night." Sam considered her words, understanding their truth. "You saved my life," he said simply. "I was dying by degrees, and you gave me a reason to live again." "You saved mine first," Emma replied, "and you're still saving it every day you choose to protect me." Their relationship had evolved beyond simple protection into something deeper and more complex. They were two damaged people who had found healing in each other's presence, who had discovered that sometimes the most broken souls were the ones best equipped to understand and mend each other's pain. But both of them knew that their newfound peace was fragile, that Burke would return with greater force and more resources. The confrontation that was coming would test everything they'd built together, would force them to choose between the safety of surrender and the risk of fighting for what they'd found. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sam took Emma's hand in his, feeling the strength and warmth of her presence. Whatever was coming, they would face it together, and for the first time in 10 years, Sam Mackenzie felt like he had something worth fighting for. The ghost of Broken Creek Ranch had remembered what it meant to be dangerous, and he was prepared to prove it to anyone who threatened what was his. Chapter 5. Building tomorrow from yesterday's ashes. 6 months had passed since that stormy night when Emma had appeared at Sam's door, and Broken Creek Ranch had transformed into something neither of them could have imagined. The house that had once stood as a monument to grief and loss now pulsed with life and purpose, its rooms filled with laughter, conversation, and the kind of warmth that comes from people who have found their place in the world. Emma had proven to be everything Sam had hoped for, and more. Her strength, which had been hidden beneath layers of trauma and fear, had emerged gradually as she healed, revealing a woman of remarkable resilience and determination. She had not only survived the worst that life could throw at her, but had emerged from it with her capacity for love and hope intact. The school she had established in Cedar Ridge had become the talk of the territory. What had started as a simple desire to teach children to read and write had evolved into something much more significant, a beacon of learning and hope in a land where education was often considered a luxury. Emma had convinced Sam to donate lumber and supplies, and the townspeople had provided the labor to build a proper schoolhouse on the edge of town. Every morning, Emma would ride into Cedar Ridge in the buggy Sam had bought for her, her saddlebags filled with books and supplies, her face bright with the anticipation of the day ahead. The children adored her, and their parents had come to respect her strength and dedication. She had become more than just a teacher. She had become a symbol of what was possible when people refused to let circumstances define their futures. "Miss Emma," 7-year-old Sarah Patterson had said one afternoon, her small hand raised eagerly in the air, "Will you teach us about the stars tonight?" Emma's evening astronomy lessons had become legendary in Cedar Ridge. Once a week, she would gather the children and their families in the schoolyard, where she would use her knowledge of the constellations to teach them about navigation, mythology, and the vastness of the universe. These sessions had become community events, bringing together families who might not otherwise interact and creating bonds that strengthened the entire town. Sam would often attend these gatherings, standing at the back of the crowd with his hat in his hands, watching Emma work with the kind of pride that comes from seeing someone you love fulfill their dreams. The townspeople had initially been suspicious of the mysterious woman who had appeared at the ranch, but Emma's dedication and kindness had won them over completely. "She's good for you, Sam," Dr. Henry Caldwell had observed one evening after one of Emma's astronomy lessons. "Good for all of us, really. This town needed someone like her."